All right, fantastic. So in the interest of time, let's get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We've got a fantastic topic with some amazing panelists here. The topic is commercializing AI solutions in medicine and healthcare. I'd first like to start with the University of Toronto land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The Temerty Centre for AI Research and Education in Medicine at the University of Toronto has been made possible by the generous donation of the Temerty family. T-CAIREM is an interdepartmental center that serves as a focal point for collaboration among healthcare providers, trainees, researchers, computer scientists, engineers, industry, and lots of others. Our goal is to transform health through AI. Just a quick note that this event is CPD accredited. So to obtain your CPD credit, please complete the evaluation form that we will email to all attendees following this event. And don't forget to provide your name and email on the address, your email address on the evaluation form. And another note to attendees, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions for the panelists. I'll be monitoring this fairly frequently, and then they will address them during the discussion portion of the webinar. We may not get to all of the questions, but feel free to use that function. This event is also being live tweeted. So please follow along using the hashtag Temerty Talks. So I'd like to now introduce our panelists. We're very fortunate to have three incredibly talented and experienced people as our panelists. I'm going to actually introduce them and then have them talk. And I'm going to go one by one so you're fresh on their intros right before they speak. Our first panelist is Dr. Igor Jurisica, who is a senior scientist at the Osteoarthritis Research Program, the Division of Orthopedic Surgery, and Schroeder Arthritis Institute, and the Krembil Research Institute. He's also a professor at the University of Toronto and a visiting scientist at IBM. In 2019, he was included in the top 100 AI leaders in drug discovery and advanced healthcare. So I'd really like to welcome Igor. And Igor, if you could say a few words on this topic, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Mohammed, for the nice introduction and everybody part of this panel. I'm really honored and excited to be here. So my background is really computer science, and I started to study how to build intelligent machines, machine learning, knowledge discovery, knowledge representation, and so on. But relatively early in my career, I got really excited and drawn into biomedical sciences and research. And I joined at the time Ontario Cancer Institute, and I've been at the University Health Network since 2000. So this brought me as a computational scientist really very close to biomedical and especially clinical data. And so over the years, there was always this dilemma, should we try to keep just the science going, everything in open space, open data, open science, and everybody will just use it, or the evil commercialization is good for something. And definitely one of the aspects is that we need open science, and we have to have a rigorous science on the scientific side. But if you want to make treatment or new diagnosis for a disease, no company will take it unless the IP is protected. And that kind of brings it that we kind of need both, and it has to be nicely separated, even though there are obviously nothing is black and white, it's shades of gray in terms of when and how this should happen. So there's always a lot of excitement and discussion over the last few years, especially with neural networks and application into medicine or AI in general. One of the aspects is that AI started many years back, and there was always this dilemma of what is generic, what is specific in terms of this technology. Can you, for example, just commercialize the algorithm itself or its application? And so what is really critical in this combination of AI and medicine is that it's a technology and it's a biomedical part that needs to gel nicely together. And then it has to be trained and properly validated. And those steps are very important because the engineers who build the AI systems don't have the accreditation that clinicians have. and we obviously don't want to be liable for misdiagnosis or mistreatment. So there has to be a nice balance of ethical consideration, how this technology can be applied and should be applied, and also who are the users. Across the domains, it's always tricky, and in medicine, doubly so, that users may not know what they want. Users may not be able to articulate what and how they would like to solve. So it's always a dialogue going back and forth to find the right solution for the right problem and then try to move it forward. So it's really exciting to have multiple panelists also from startup companies and biotech, and also CDL that definitely harbored many great companies that started in this field. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Igor. That was fantastic. And the way our panelists are structured is Igor represents really the entrepreneurial academic who's kind of embedded in the academic environment, but has this very nice mindset around how we actually can make things practical and commercialized beyond our walls in the academic sector. Our second panelist then will move the needle a bit further. Is really involved in, well, all right, well, what do startups look like? How do they actually function in the academic environment? And how can we actually promote entrepreneurism and commercialization in academia? Dr. Matthew Platt received his PhD from the University of Guelph in human health, specifically in cardiovascular physiology in 2019, on the heels of an honors undergraduate degree in biomedical sciences. As the Associate Director of Health Streams at the Creative Destruction Lab, he oversees the recruitment, evaluation, and selection of seed-stage deep tech companies in health and creates more opportunities for health ventures across the larger CDL network. So really in a position to help our academic community really embrace commercialization. Matt, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for Mohammed and for the invitation to speak on this panel. I'd love to start with a story because I think a story best captures the way that CDL works. And this story is actually about a company that I recruited back in July of 2020 called Applicate Technologies. They were two Yale profs that were working to build a device that fully automates tissue pathology. And for anybody who's done histology as I did in my grad school, I thought the concept of fully automating tissue pathology was fascinating and certainly deserved a double click. So I got on the phone with them, and being two Yale profs, they explained that they've been working on this technology for the last 8 years. They've been passionate about the problem for the last 14. And while they were deeply committed to trying to build a company, they weren't really sure what the first steps were. How do we transition from being the innovators and the builders of the tech to actually building a business that we can then go and start to scale? So that's when I explained to them the CDL program. And what is the Creative Destruction Lab? Well, we're a business mentorship program for scientists. We're building companies around a scientific or technological advancement. We're a place where these early stage ventures can come explain their scientific innovation and get credible feedback from entrepreneurs, investors, and scientists on their strategic decisions as they really transition from being a research project to being an investable business. Now, they were sold. Again, as profs that don't usually have access to a large network of entrepreneurs and investors, the idea of getting concentrated feedback on the things that they weren't an expert in seemed very valuable. So they came into the program and they got into CDL based on the credibility of their technology and its massive potential. And within the program, started to build champions, mentors that aligned with the big vision and the mission that they were trying to accomplish, saw the potential of the technology, and also saw that they were able to help them build a business case for the cool technology they'd built. Throughout the program, they ended up getting feedback on an investable business plan. They helped CDL mentors not only help them build the plan, but also were large contributors to their $2.5 million seed round at the end of the program. And a mentor even joined as chairman of the board. They now have a prototype device in 3 different hospital pathology labs and are looking forward to a Series A raise to build out their manufacturing capabilities. And what I've seen now for about 3 cycles of working with companies at CDL is we often get ventures that apply with really great technology, but a very uncertain and often uninvestable business. The folks who apply to CDL are often technical teams, people like those on the call, I can imagine, with a massive vision and a problem that they want to solve, but they're often uncertain of the small and incremental steps that they need to realize the massive vision of building a company. And certainly the reason CDL exists is because the best innovators often have the least business experience. because those are two entirely different domains. While a good scientist sets intelligent hypotheses, designs robust experiments, informs their future decisions, often on the curation of high quality data sets, a good business leader communicates the value of their technology to those that would be well served by paying for it. And it's at CDL where a lot of that storytelling and refinement of the business case for a technology ends up being fleshed out. And really what I've seen as it relates to the commercialization of AI in medicine is the companies that came to CDL about 5 years ago were trying to translate AI solutions for prediction problems. Whereas now we're starting to see a new wave of AI in healthcare, which tends to be the application of computational systems on top of devices to constantly iterate on the device's ability to generate high quality data and to deliver on its value prop. Or we see individuals that are trying to reshape entire healthcare industries around predictions rather than just selling those predictions to particular users.
That is great. Thank you so much, Matt. That was fantastic. Our next panelist is someone who actually has been in the academic environment and said, you know what, I'm actually going to go head first and live the startup world. So Dr. Mara Lederman is co-founder and chief operating officer of Signal One, a digital health company that provides hospitals with an end-to-end clinical AI solution. Prior to launching Signal One, Mara was a professor of strategy at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. And while at Rotman, Mara served as the site lead for the Creative Destruction Lab, the world-leading mentorship program for science and technology-based startups. Mara, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Mohammed. And hi, everybody. Great to see so many people on the call today. And it's a treat to be on this panel with Igor and Matt, both of whom I've known for a long time through our work at CDL. So it's fun to reconnect to a very different audience. So as Mohammed said, I've kind of worn 3 hats over my 19-year career. For a long time, I wore this sort of standard academic hat. Now, I wasn't a scientist. I was a social scientist. My background and research were in economics. Then I spent many years working at and scaling the Creative Destruction Lab. So I've really had that vantage point of how do we help, as Matt says, science-based companies turn into, or science-based startups turn into scalable, investable businesses. And now I'm on leave from the university, actually launching startup Signal One, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I had sort of 3 points I thought I'd make in these opening remarks that try to pick up on each of those. I think the first thing that I think could be useful for this audience is just sort of thinking deeply about, why do we need to commercialize? And again, this picks up on where Igor started us about sort of the tension between what we try to do with research and open science, and then the barriers to getting open science into products and services that make people's lives better and drive sort of prosperity. And at the end of the day, if you sort of think back and say, why do we have universities? Why do governments throw so much money into research? It's not just to discover new knowledge and enlighten us. Of course, that's the first point, but ultimately it's to discover knowledge that then makes its way into either kind of practice or into goods and services that solve kind of pressing or unpressing, but we hope, pressing problems. And so really there's always this kind of tension between funding basic research, in my mind, where we actually don't know if there is commercial potential, and funding and incentivizing applied research where the sort of commercial potential is more obvious. Because a lot of that applied research that we now understand the commercial potential of once started as basic research that nobody understood the commercial potential of. And that's not just true in science and medicine, but that's true in economics and other fields. And so if I think about my own field, commercialization looks a little bit different, but the thing we strive to do is actually impact policy and business practice. And there's a heck of a lot of research that even happens in business schools that right now nobody can see the link to, say, policy or business practice. But we know 15 years down the road, or 10 years, maybe 7 years, with all of the follow-on research, we will eventually see the implications. And of course, the same is true in science and the same is true in AI. I think in the very earliest sort of, research into deep learning, none of us imagined things like like, Siri and search and all of the applications of machine learning that seem so obvious today. And so we really do need research and commercialization, or what I think of as basic and applied research, to coexist. We can't, and we have to be careful that we don't sort of shun basic research, because the link to kind of really downstream products and services isn't obvious. That link has to kind of emerge in the follow-on. At the same time, you're seeing this increasingly with funding mechanisms and through the advent of programs like CDL and many others, that we are trying to nudge that research into finding sort of the commercial applications, so that ultimately all the work that goes on in universities doesn't just live in journals, but actually changes the way we live and work. So I think that's just a really important framing about, how do we think about research and commercialization together. Second point I wanted to make really picks up on things Matt said, and I hopefully we'll come back to this, is, what makes commercialization so darn hard? And many, many things make it hard. Many of those things aren't unique to AI in medicine, and some of them are. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think it's really important to understand the incredible kind of risk and uncertainty that comes with trying to commercialize a truly novel scientific discovery, right? The very fact that it's novel science is what gives it incredible potential, right? And I love Matt's example of Applicate. I remember that company from CDL. People were so excited because they thought they would do for histology sort of what happened to radiology, whatever it was, 15 years prior. But because it's so novel and so new, there's so much uncertainty. And that uncertainty takes the form of basic questions like, will it even work? If it works, what will it do? And if it does the thing you tell me it's going to do, does anyone care, and will they pay for it? And so, researchers who are starting to move down the commercialization path need to start answering those questions, which of course have chicken and egg problems. Well, I don't know what it'll do until I build it. But why should I build it until I'm sure that it hits some need and somebody will pay for it? But how do I convince those people until I've built it? And so the whole process of building a startup early on is about finding kind of low-cost proof points or validation that starts showing the potential, the market potential of what you're doing, so you can raise money to support it. And then I just think so people don't realize that this is so much of what startups do early on. Everybody thinks that what startups are trying to do is get early customers and generate revenue. That's actually not what they're trying to do in their first few years. They're trying to hit milestones that convinces people that there's a real business, not one or two customers, but a meaningful business to be had. And then finally, the last thing I'll say, this also picked up on something Matt said, but this is just so front and center at the work we're trying to do at Signal One. We're building AI solutions that will deploy into hospitals and whose end users will be doctors and nurses within hospitals. There's a big difference between building a technology and building a business. And there's so much stuff that goes into building a business that is not nearly as interesting as the underlying science and technology, or as innovative. Hiring people, going through regulatory approvals, contracting, setting up the ML operations and the DevOps to support the models, which feel like, the sexy part, building sales compensation schemes. And researchers aren't trained, or usually don't have the interest in doing that. And again, it's about pairing them with people who can help them down that path.
Yeah, fantastic comments and thoughts. These are really, really fantastic reflections from people who actually are living and breathing this space. So Igor, from an academic perspective and from a commercialization perspective, Matthew, who sees tons and tons of companies and startups really wanting to make it big, and Mara, who said, yeah, I've seen it, I'm going to do it, and really is actively in that space right now with a very young startup. So I'd like to encourage everyone to put in their questions in the Q&A box. We're going to start off with a question that is a little bit more general. Oh, sorry, one sec. I'm just going to grab a couple of things in play here. And I'd like to kind of open this question up to the entire panel group, so feel free to jump in. One of the fundamental questions is, why do we need to commercialize? Why can't everything be open source? Why do we have to go down this commercialization route?
I'm happy to take that one first, if that's okay,
Sure.
Mohammed. And again, I think Igor and I touched on this a little bit, but I'll put on my economist hat here, which also sort of parlays into my COO hat. Markets provide incentives. Markets aren't perfect, but markets provide incentives. And so by commercializing a product, by turning it into something that you sell to buyers, you subject a company and sort of the people behind that company to the types of incentives that markets create. So what do I mean by that? If you're going to find a buyer, you are highly incentivized to build a product that meets those buyers' needs. And this has come up already. Sometimes, this is really tricky, especially with novel products. Those buyers don't even know what their needs are. But if I draw on an example from Signal One, with all that, we can do all the fancy machine learning we want. But if we don't build an interface and a communication mechanism that is convenient for doctors and nurses to use, they won't look at it. They won't use it, and will have no impact. So number one, markets create incentive for the suppliers, the firms, to build products that the market demands and has willingness to pay for. And that's what we want. We love science, but we don't, and this is something CDL companies struggle with. They have an innovation and they're still in search of the market. And sometimes that's fine. That's what the program is to do. The other thing markets do is they create competition. Competition is good for a few things. It incentivizes competition on price. Lower prices are good. Number two, it incentivizes competition in quality, right? So, if there is no competition for your product, you might provide a high price, low quality product because there's no alternatives. Competition forces you to differentiate, to find niches, to specialize, to elevate quality. And of course, competition is what actually creates incentives in the private sector for innovation. So that's kind of my economist view on why we need to do this. It's to make sure we're getting high quality, cost competitive products that truly meet a deep market need.
Thank you. Igor, Matt, anything to add?
I think I would just add that actually the question that was on a Q&A, that Mara basically just partially answered the question, because definitely one aspect is that clinicians are not usually engineers, although there are some exceptions, and they are not mathematicians by training. So you can do interesting modeling analysis and so on, but you have to present the information in a way that they can understand and they can react to. On the same way, then, the doctor has to explain, for example, the diagnosis or prognosis to the patient. And the important aspect is that if the patient does not believe that that's the right strategy, part of the battle is already lost. So again, they will have an even wider area of background, and one is obliged to present it in a way to make a convincing argument. So it's always important how to visualize the data, how to present it in multiple different ways. AI, again, could be helpful. Many years back, one of the natural language understanding profs at computer science, Graham Hurst, he was working on how you can take, for example, text that is described on a pamphlet, for example, risk of developing cardiovascular diseases, and how can you automatically change the text for people with different background, ethnic and otherwise, language, because the same English text read by people with a background from Europe or from Asia or from South America may be understood completely differently. So kind of, again, presenting it in the right context for the right audience is important.
Fantastic.
Sure, and I'll jump in right at the end just to kind of tie both of those together. The word commercialization is the process of introducing a new product into the market. And in health, that means commercialization is bringing a technology from an experimental place where you think it can do a thing into a real world place where it actually does a thing so well that people will pay for it. And the reason that commercialization in health is so important is it's how we continue to advance our system and deliver better products that give better outcomes to patients, that make the work flow for physicians and nurses better. It's how we optimize the system and how we continue to advance the system. And because we have an audience here that is more on the research side, maybe thinking about commercialization, the act of receiving money, this is actually something I got from Mara that has kind of sat with me. The act of receiving money for a service isn't the same as putting a publication behind a paywall. What it's really doing is it's forcing a level of accountability to the creator of the product to make sure that they continue to strive for the outcome that that product is promising. And that level of accountability in a marketplace in health is incredibly important. If you just leave a technology out in the open, hoping that somebody else will do something with it, it is very unlikely that they are going to take that product to the market, because they're not the ones who built the technology. They won't understand it. They're going to build the thing that they do understand, which may be a completely different product than the one that you think you're capable of putting together.
Very good. Thank you. Really good thoughts. I'm actually going to take the liberty of being a moderator and go to the audience questions. And there's one that kind of follows this theme around purpose, like why commercialize? And the question is, how can we ensure commercializing AI doesn't fall into a trap of feeding a wealthy consumer market rather than addressing inequities in healthcare, which may not be apparent in the market? So any responses at that end?
I will just respond very quickly on that. Be the one to commercialize. If you're leading the business, you get to decide where that business goes. You will not be able, at least from my perspective, control everybody else's business, but you can certainly control the one that you are building. And that is why I work at the Creative Destruction Lab, for people that want to take the plunge and actually attempt to do that, and to give them the best chance of being successful.
I'm happy to jump in. It's a great question, and I think it's an appropriate question. And I would say, to some degree, we see this happen even at Creative Destruction Lab, even though we're trying to avoid that. And what I mean by that is, often we see, and Matt can disagree, and I'd be curious if he agrees. Often we see health startups trying to take a faster path to market by either going direct to consumers or choosing kind of a direct to pharma or a research application, because selling into, let's say, the hospital system, which is what we're trying to do, is so hard. And so I think one of the reasons we might worry that the question you ask could materialize is the nature of sort of funding for healthcare, right? It is always easy it is hard to sell, perhaps ironically, into the public funded system. It is easier to sell into entities that are themselves privately motivated. Now, that being said, what I hope can happen is, if you can manage to sort of sell, let's say, into the hospital system here, you are motivated. The hospital system in Canada treats everybody, right? So in any given hospital, I mean, to some degree, it's segregated by geography, but you do have representation from across socioeconomic and other types of populations. And so you aren't just selling to, let's say, a private insurer, for example, but rather you're either selling to the hospital system or to a government payer. But I think, to your point, it is very important when we're thinking about this in healthcare to also engage the government, who, at least in Canada, of course, is the payer, to support these types of commercialization, because many players in healthcare do not naturally have the financial incentive to adopt these new technologies, which could end up leading companies to either focus on consumers with higher willingness to pay, to focus on sort of the private pockets of a publicly funded system, or to focus on buyers like pharmaceutical companies that are privately motivated. So I think it's a concern. And I think there's a real role for government to play here.
And maybe I will add one additional aspect to it, because, for example, AI applications can help even general practitioner, or let me backtrack. Clinicians become better experts the more patients they can see. And that's the reason why, for example, Princess Margaret Hospital is the hospital for cancer treatment, because they see a lot more patients than smaller rural places. But once you build an advisory system for an oncologist or radiologist that then gets deployed through different hospitals, they get, through the training of that system, advantage of providing similar kind of quality or same kind of quality across different hospitals, and thus reducing some of these disparities of city versus rural area quality of healthcare.
Very good. And I think so, Ashley, it was a great question. You've obviously fueled a lot of good answers. So the response, I think, really is to be that solution that you wish to see. And I'm going to jump over to another question. There are lots of challenges in commercialization and creating product and such. And there is this balance around private, public sector, open source, patents and protecting things. So there's a couple of questions in this theme around, Philip has asked this and so has Christopher, around privacy of healthcare data in the public sector. So Philip writes, I imagine that there are various laws surrounding the privacy of healthcare data in the public sector. Could this be a significant barrier in commercializing AI in the public sector? If so, what are the ways we can alleviate this problem? And Chris has asked in the similar vein, when it comes to obtaining data, some companies, academics, and hospitals are understandably protective of this data. Is there any consensus whether governmental levels should be involved with data acquisition, sourcing, and sharing, so that this is open access to all? And can anyone commercialize and benefit from it? And also, I think to bounce off of Ashley's thoughts as well, open access also reduces inequities in data acquisition. So a question out to the group around data, open access, being very protective. How do you get over these hurdles and barriers?
Maybe I can start because I would add there are additional challenges, because it's not only access to the data, but also ensuring quality, integrity of the data over the years. And that's actually one of the often forgotten aspects of machine learning systems, because they need data to train and validate. However, a lot of these data are in public domain. Once it's released, it will have different shapes of form, and especially omics data, different normalization techniques, different preprocessing will modify the data, and the machine learning systems will gain different insights from different versions of this data. Importantly, if you look through PubMed, there is about 8% of papers retracted every year. And the curve is really discouraging and growing rapidly. So now the challenge is that while the paper gets retracted, the data may still live in the open space somewhere. And if there is a flaw with the paper, there might be a flaw with the data. But we don't know if that flawed data has been used to train a system that will provide radiological advice in cancer treatment. So one has to be careful of who has access to the data, how it's controlled, how is accuracy is assured, and so on. So on one side, yes, open access is definitely useful. We can do reproducible science, we can verify quality and so on, but that also potentially creates these additional challenges. And so custodians, hospitals are good custodians for such data, probably better than government. They deal with other kind of data. Sometimes even those are not treated as well as they should be. And we need to ensure that there is reasonable access to it, but also there are reasonable protections.
I don't have a ton to add. I mean, I think there's always a trade-off between privacy and innovation, and that's been recognized for a long time. And I think there is a recognition by government of the role they can play here. You know, no one wants to compromise patient privacy. At the same time, we need to strike a balance. Data is a massive source of innovation with the growth of, with the potential of applying machine learning to data and healthcare. It may be, I don't know if this is true, and maybe Igor does, but what one might argue probably maybe it's the greatest potential for innovation in healthcare over the next 10 years is by using the data that's generated. I don't know if that's true, but either way, it's big. And so if we go too far to the extreme around privacy protection, we crowd out all that innovation. Of course, if we go too far to making all the data available without privacy protections, I think we infringe on privacy rights that we hold kind of near and dear. Places are finding ways to navigate this balance. And I think technology solutions are also emerging to help with privacy protection, different ways of encrypting data, of stripping. We see companies doing this at CDL also in our AI stream, trying to strip personal information out of data. So I think there is this kind of constant need to balance this tension. I do think there is a role for governments as well to both help sort of standardize how data is collected and stored, make it easier to connect with each other. The models can learn more. I think that's one way to protect against underrepresented populations that might be too underrepresented in any, let's say, one hospital's or province's data set, but is better represented in a larger data set. And also making sure that the privacy laws balance the need for protection with the need to enable innovation.
Well, I certainly don't have anything to add on the policy side. Just from a research perspective, the companies that come into CDL that have the greatest potential of doing something very unique and impactful have generated their own data sets. And that's because from a research perspective, anytime that you're looking at old data and trying to make new conclusions without being able to control for variables that may be incredibly important for that particular use case, you're probably training algorithms on a faulty data set. And the benefit of being in a research environment is that you can often fund the ability to create data that is truly optimized for the use case that you believe your technology is going to be able to deliver on. And the benefit of being in research is there is less of a time crunch on having to generate it in a 4-month window. It's just, it would almost be beneficial to consult with individuals that, like Igor, who have seen this sort of commercialization runway to understand what type of data fidelity will be important for the particular business case that you may want to pose later.
Very good, thank you. I think there's a comment from Daoud around a pending Bill C-27, which is going to have stronger language to support better protection for personal data. And you know, there are pros and cons to each of these things, right? I'm going to flip over to the other side and talk about somebody, maybe somebody actually has a really great idea, but is struggling with, all right, do I actually publish on this? Do I keep it a secret? Do I patent it? So the question is it possible to patent an AI algorithm, or is it best to keep it as a trade secret during the commercialization process? Who wants to take that one?
I can only speak to what I've seen. I do not know, I'm not an expert in what is better, especially over the longer term, but certainly what we see at CDL often is that it is kept a trade secret, that the algorithm, to patent an algorithm is essentially giving away a lot of how you are doing a particular prediction. And what is valuable to these companies is a deep understanding of a problem and the creation of an algorithm that addresses core issues with that problem, which is why if you are thinking about commercialization and there's a problem in healthcare that you are deeply interested in, consult with a lot of people that work in that workflow, that are part of that problem. Because if you can build a solution for that particular problem that is informed by people that deeply understand it, it will be hard to outcompete that solution just with some algorithm that you're now trying to deploy onto a particular problem. And that does speak to like the different directions you can go. You either invent a technology, find a problem to solve, and then try to match it with product dev over time, or you build a solution for a problem and are optimizing it right from the beginning.
Great. And are there, Benjamin's asking, are there any open source licenses you can use to commercialize a piece of software? Any,
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, which is, are there existing tools that take an algorithm and turn it into a software product that you can distribute?
Yeah, I believe that's it. And Benjamin, please feel free to expand on that if you like, but I believe that's the intent of the question.
I mean, so the definition of open source is that anybody can do anything they want with it. You can use it for academic purposes, you can use it for commercial purposes. And probably the most familiar example is Linux. You can download it for free, but there are companies who sell services or who sell licenses to Linux.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. Yeah, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything, Mara.
No, I just think even there's more that goes into commercializing something. Like as Matt said, commercialization is really taking a novel product to market. That means providing the support and the service behind that product. That means providing the user training. That means in some cases, having a recall process. And so I think just thinking about, maybe there's an early step that is, I've sort of built this algorithm. How do I turn this into more of a sort of professional software product? There's a lot more, even beyond that, there's a lot more that goes into commercialization, I think. And I guess that's worth keeping in mind.
Yeah. And so, okay, yeah, I think Benjamin's responding, yes, the core is open source, but you can develop a service around it. So GPL, MIT, Apache, those sorts of things. Any comments on that end, or should we move to the next question?
That's outside my expertise, so.
Yeah. All right. Yep. Sorry, Benjamin. Now, if we go along this theme around data, there's another question from the audience, Francis, who's saying, what might be the role of large data repositories and research data consortia in supporting commercialization of applications for healthcare? And the point I want to highlight here is research data and how we may want to be able to maybe think about research data versus actual real world data with all the blemishes and the bruises that we typically see in the wild. I think, Matthew, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just very quickly, because again, this is a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but again, speaking on what I've seen for companies, there is a role for large data repositories if they are better at being open about the variables that were actually controlled for, so that you understand deeper what that data set is actually telling you. Because mentors have often pushed people, if they are only training their algorithm on public data sets, how do you know that your predictions are actually going to work in a very specific use case where different variables are at play? And so there's perhaps a role for these large data consortiums in being proof of concept work, but even that can be a little dangerous, because again, if you're unsure of the variables that are controlled for in those experiments, it can be really hard to consider that prediction to be reflective of a prediction that you want to make in a business setting.
I would add maybe that there are already several examples. For example, in Toronto, we have Structural Genomics Consortium, Cheryl Aerosmith and Aled Edwards running it. And it's a consortium of publicly funded research and pharma companies. A lot of the data is in public domain, but there is obviously a lot of commercialization inventions that go through it. Another, especially over the recent years, very great example from UK. The UK Biobank. It's basically publicly clinical data available with a certain access. Academics and companies can gain access to it and can be used for either new discoveries, training of the machine learning system, or validation. And so several of these would definitely be are already important. TCGA, the Cancer Genome Atlas. Again, in a sense, you can view it as a large data set of multi-omic across about 33 different cancers and different histologies. And so without those, and this is in a sense the kind of beginning of this divide between publicly available, so you can scrutinize it, you can move science on it, but also you can use it for commercial purposes with a specific license.
Very good. Thank you. There are a few more questions from the audience, which why don't we tackle them now? I think this one's pointed more towards Matt and your experience as well, Mara. At CDL, what is the success rate of health startups becoming successful commercial enterprises? Can you share a success story of an application that saw high adoption in the healthcare industry? Or what are the pitfalls to avoid when trying to commercialize for the healthcare space?
Sure, I can tackle this one first. I mean, this is a great question because it really gets at the question of what is success, what defines success. Because in some ways, figuring out that the problem you're trying to solve or the technology that you're trying to use to solve it is a bad idea and a waste of your time, that could actually be a success. And because we had an example of a company that came through CDL like 7 years ago with a bad idea, and the mentors told them, don't do this. This is a waste of your time. 2 years later, they reapplied, got in with a different company, and that company is Xanadu. And Xanadu is one of only 2 companies to reach quantum supremacy. And this would not have happened likely if and they're based in Toronto. And this would not have happened likely if the mentors didn't tell the founder that their initial idea was perhaps a waste of their time. When it comes to the success of actually becoming commercial enterprises, the companies we work with are at the pre-seed to seed stage. So often 3, 5 to even 10 years away from being active in market. So it is something that we are tracking. Some of the companies that you may recognize that are the closest to commercial viability would be a company like Deep Genomics, came through CDL in 2015 and has now raised a little over $100 million. BenchSci is another example of AI in medicine. It was 3 PhDs that got together and tried to figure out how to reduce the amount of time it takes to do high quality experiments with antibodies by looking at all the different information available in the literature and quickly computing which antibodies would be the best for a particular experiment. They're another great CDL success story because they actually found their CEO in the program. It was one of the MBAs that worked with them. And now they're over 300 employees and take multi-million-dollar contracts with pharma. I'm not sure if that necessarily gets to all the parts of the question, but I would be more than happy to talk offline about pitfalls to avoid when trying to commercialize in the healthcare space for you in particular, because it is very industry and technology specific.
I don't have much to add. I think that was a great answer. And I do want to double click on Matt's first point, which is, for for people with very high opportunity cost of time, because they have so much talent and so much potential, learning that the path they're pursuing is the wrong one is actually a very, very valuable thing, not just to them, but to society. And so part of what CDL does is course correct these very talented people either into different applications, different verticals, or sometimes into different startups in the future. And that's considered a success. The only other thing I'll add is because our companies are so early stage and because they're deep tech, so the path to market can be very long, the way we actually measure the success of the program is through the equity value created by the companies. And so what essentially the companies come to CDL at a seed stage, sometimes pre-seed, they haven't really raised any money. By the end of their year in CDL, they typically raise a seed round, right, Matt? That sounds about right. Very rarely a Series A. And I know we're using a lot of inside speak. So for people who don't know what the heck we're talking about, when companies raise money, it goes in stages. And we typically call those stages a seed round or a pre-seed. That's your very first couple of checks in, often from friends and family or sort of what are called angel investors. And then when you go more to institutional money from venture capital firms, we call those series. So a Series A is the first, then a B, then a C, then a D, and so on. And so one of the ways we see that, where we see that CDL is having an impact is by looking at the extent to which companies that graduate from a program then go on over the next few years to be able to raise meaningful Series A and Series B rounds, because that is a sign that external investors are seeing them de-risk the business enough to put capital into it.
That's great. Thank you. We have a question from Jay around recruitment. So how important right now is it in the drug discovery and diagnosis with AI industry to have team members with both health science and data science ML knowledge? Often the job description published by the recruiter is quite ambiguous. For example, they want a PhD in biology or a data scientist, and this leads to ignoring candidates who have combined knowledge in both areas. So our industry is looking and taking a different recruitment approach for hiring candidates, people who have specific expertise in different areas or people who combine expertise.
I'm happy to jump in, but I was the last to speak. So if either of the other two want to.
I can speak again to what we see at the Creative Destruction Lab. I'm realizing high throughput of companies is probably the greatest thing that I benefited, the education that I get from the Creative Destruction Lab. At the early stages of recruitment, it is imperative that if you want to do a thing, that you have somebody with that experience on your team or working closely with your team. Otherwise, investors will look at you and go, why are you the person to understand the problem space well enough to build the solution that people will eventually pay for? So in the early days of recruitment, that sort of cross industry experience is that would actually make you a better founder because you're able to tether different industries together or different problem areas together. I can't speak to how executive level recruitment is happening at the levels of companies, but certainly they would be well, maybe if I could get a little bit more clarity on the question here, are you looking to join a startup? Are you looking to build one and are asking about how to go about recruitment yourself?
Yeah, I don't think that was clear in the question, but I think the general answers that were given, I think were pretty insightful. Maybe in the interest of time, I do want to tackle at least one or two more questions before we end. There are a few really good ones here too. One, I think this one's going to be more directed towards perhaps Mara, but the other panel members feel free to jump in. Do you believe Canada's fee-for-service model makes it harder to commercialize AI-driven health solutions as opposed to the US, where there are more value-based care incentives, rewards, and penalties for services and potentially higher willingness to pay?
So I do think so, and I've told sort of the government this as well. But let me sort of draw the analogy to what you would find in an industry if you were selling into an industry that isn't healthcare. If you were building a B2B business and you were trying to sell to, enterprises or medium-sized business, and you had some technology, you would come to them, and there's only two things you would say to them. You would say, I have a product or I have a technology that's going to grow your revenue. So it's either going to make your product better and as a result, bring in more customers or increase quality so you can charge a higher price. So it's going to help you increase revenue, or it's going to lower your costs. So you can do everything you were doing before and lower your costs. Either way, we're having a direct impact in some sense on the company's margin or sort of profit function as we think about in economics. And that's what we see, that's what we see in kind of all the non-health streams at CDL. If you're selling into another business, you need to show how your technology changes that business's economics. That's what I've been teaching my students. That's what I teach at Next 36. That's what we teach, in the course around CDL. B2B businesses have to understand their customer economics. And for most customers, those economics are revenues and costs. And so you're either helping them earn more revenues, and that extra revenue justifies paying for your product, or you're lowering their costs, and that cost reduction justifies paying for your product. When you think about a publicly funded service, it's not just that it's fee for service, but there's also, at least at the hospital sector, no real competition across hospitals, right? Hospitals have populations they serve. They're not trying to steal patients from each other, which for many reasons is a good thing. But if you don't have a system where you can either drive incremental revenue or generate real cost reductions, it is hard to make an economic case for the product. And so I think that does make it hard in a system where hospitals largely have kind of global budgets. They have some procedures they're paid for, on a per procedure basis, and they all have backlogs of patients, or most of them have backlogs of patients. So I do think it is a challenge, because if you want to charge a customer, you do need to show how you are changing their economics. And the economics of healthcare organizations are very different than many other types of organizations.
Fantastic. And I've got two more questions before we end. One, and that previous question was from Chef Farouk, and this one is from Mark. And I'm going to target this towards Igor. What role do you see for health authorities, hospitals, providers in supporting the advancement of innovations from early TRL to market entry? Who should pay for that extra work taken on by the health system or providers?
That's a great question. From the academic side, definitely there are multiple mechanisms. There are Ontario Research Fund, Genome Canada has multiple programs that are especially geared towards kind of translational research and commercialization aspect. They are not ideal, or they are obviously, it's not without the flaws of how does it support, but they do provide at least some kind of transition through this gap. The other possibility on many of the hospitals and research institutes is also foundations. There are also grants basically that are provided through foundations for commercialization or translational research possibilities. More could be done for sure.
No, fantastic. Thank you. And I'm going to wrap up with one more question. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, I'm going to put you on the spot. If there was one piece of advice that you could give to a budding entrepreneur in an academic environment like the University of Toronto community, let's say it's an academic at a hospital, in a hospital setting or not, or it's a computer scientist who's really brand new to this and really, really wants to do a startup and has an incredibly bright idea. What's that one piece of advice that you would give them? Maybe we could go with Igor, Matt, and then Mara.
It's a loaded question. I would say believe in the technology or in the idea that you have and follow it thoroughly. That means have all of the support on your side and question it to ensure that you are not guided by your own biases. But then it's important to interact with others, both for validation or for bouncing the ideas or for connecting with organizations like CDL or programs like CDL, where the science can be then married into the business.
Yeah, that is a loaded question because there's a few pieces of advice, and I don't even think I'm the one who should be giving advice at this particular stage because it really is at the concept stage. What I believe deeply is you need to find something you're extremely passionate about solving, because being an entrepreneur is incredibly trying. It's going to be difficult. Lots of things aren't going to work. If the problem that you're looking to solve, you're incredibly passionate about, that usually underpins a lot of the success that we see, because it will be difficult to scale. And then if you're looking for, you should talk to people. The thing that a lot of people do is they try to build a solution without talking to the customers that they think might use it. And if you very quickly go, this is the problem I want to solve, and I'm going to just knock on people's door who I think might use this, you may find out that the problem isn't a problem for them, or the solution that you're building isn't a fit for their workflow. And then the likelihood that you're actually going to be able to deploy with that customer is low. So you need to rethink the solution that you're building. Talk to customers.
Thank you, Matt.
Okay.
Mara?
I'm going to cram two quick things in there. Number one, very early on, ask yourself, is this the thing you want to do more than everything else you could do? As academics, we tend to do a ton of things on the side of our desk. You sit on panels, and you're an editor at a journal, and you lead one of your academic organizations, and you can do all of that in your day job. You cannot build a company on the side of your desk. So ask that question. It is a very hard question because it means giving up a lot. Second piece of advice, talk to people who have done it. And in doing so, don't just talk to the people who have done it successfully. Those are going to be the easier ones to find because there's like newspaper stories about them or your colleagues mention them. We've all heard of deep genomics. Talk to the ones who have failed and understand why they have failed and what the advice would give you. You will get a very biased picture of what's involved in building a company by talking to the 1 in 10,000 who end up, or whatever the number is, being successful.
It's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for attending this fascinating session, and especially to our incredible panelists. Really, really appreciate you sharing your time and knowledge with our community. For everyone, please keep up to date by following us on Twitter at U_T_CAIREM, subscribing to the mailing list on our website, which is at tcairem.utoronto.ca, and following us on LinkedIn. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon. Take care, everyone. Bye.